call Brenda in at night. Thank y'all for coming. I'm Zoe Ryan. I'm a librarian in the North Carolina room. If none of you have ever been there, it's right around the hall to the right. We'd love to visit you and show you what we have. There is a little slip of paper on the far desk that has our next 2 monthly local history programs that you can pick up as a reminder. But I will just want to say, because I'm proud of it, the last Wednesday of July 31st, from 6 to 7, we'll be having our first local history publication from the North Carolina Room book launch party. It just came out last week, and we're real proud of it. And there's a lot of wonderful stories. Feel free to pick up a copy if you want to tonight here for $20. And we're also selling them in the North Carolina room. I was not prepared to introduce Saro tonight, but I will say that ever since we first scheduled her about half a year ago, I could not wait till tonight. I'm looking so forward to this program, and Sarah's been so much fun to work with. She's incredibly talented. We're lucky to have her here in Asheville. She's a musician, a songwriter, a folklorist, a activist, illustrator, and she's also brought some of her materials for you to look at. She'll tell you about those. Please welcome Saro.
So we're going to start by doing a holler together. Woo! Great, that's what you came here for. So this is a holler that is 2 parts. I have a part. I'm going to try and stop those pee pops, but I don't know how much I can. So I have a part, and then you have a part to do. So here's my part. Ow, ow, ow. And then this is your part. Whoop, whoop. Try that. Do it again. Awesome. So we'll do the whole thing. Here's my call. Ow, ow, ow. Fabulous. All right. So for some of you, that was your first holler, but actually probably for many of you it wasn't. We just did a holler from Sampson County, North Carolina, and that was basically me saying, I'm right here, where are you? And then you all were responding by saying, we're over here, we're coming. This is how far away we are. So I'll be presenting today on hollering traditions, mostly from Sampson County, North Carolina, and we'll be talking about what hollering is, exploring some different types of hollering, and of course I'll have you holler along with me as we go. So I'll set the scene a little bit. Imagine you're in rural North Carolina in perhaps the late 1800s. Not here, but east, across the flat farmland of the coastal plain. It's dawn, maybe 5 or 6 in the morning, and there aren't any tractors, any planes, any automobiles, any trains, no radios playing, nothing to obscure the sound. And so amongst the wind and the sounds of birds, what else you would be hearing would be lots and lots of hollering. You'd be hearing people communicating to talk about, to say, you know, in hollers, can I borrow a tool from you today? Or I'm on my way to see you, or how are you doing? These calls might sound relatively simple, like the one we just did, or they might be a little more complex. For example, here's a holler from Sampson County that was shared by a wonderful hollerer named Leonard Emanuel, and this was his good morning holler. This is how he told his neighbors that he was doing fine and feeling good. Whoa, 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 whoa. cry or phrase used to communicate with people or other animals or as a form of entertainment. A lot of us holler in our daily lives without thinking about it. So, does anyone here have a pet that you might call to in a sort of nonsensical way? Raise your hand. Yeah. So those are hollers, right? It's a way to call, maybe your cat or your dog. You may not be using the English language, but your cat or your dog knows to respond to that sound. They know to respond to that pitch or a series of pitches to know that you're calling for them. Hollers often consist of what are technically called vocables, which means syllables that don't have a set meaning. So when we go la 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 la, those are all vocables. Hollers also have certain characteristics, at least as they've been collected in this country. So often they're in a high falsetto, so when we did that woo-hoo, we're using that higher range in our voices. We're using our head voices. Also, hollers often have vocal breaks. So when I did wah-hoo-wah, you were hearing that flip going on in my voice. That's happening when I'm moving from my chest to my head voice or from my head voice to my chest voice. That's a natural kind of glottal break that happens in our vocal registers. And it happens a lot in hollering. Hollers can also just have huge musical variation. They can be rhythmic, they can be arrhythmic, they can use different kinds of scale structures, they can be simple or elaborate, as we've heard. And probably the most popularly, I'll say now, I think the two most popularly recognizable forms of hollering is what we heard at the very beginning with the suey reference. Some of us hear that in terms of calling for pigs. But also, we've heard yodeling in this country from Swiss herding traditions. So that yodeling, beep-boo, that's a hollering tradition. So I want to go ahead and ask, how many folks here grew up with hollering or know some hollers? I'm just curious. Yeah, that's great, awesome. Okay, well, when I'm done presenting, I just keep in mind, if you're willing, I'd like to see if anyone here wants to demonstrate some of the hollers they know. So just think about it. I would love it. So why do people holler? Why would you holler using syllables, using vocals, instead of just shouting words? Come over here, that sort of thing. The reason is that hollering uses sound patterns to communicate meaning instead of forcing people to distinguish the individual syllables and words. So if you think about if you're shouting words across a distance, there are all sorts of other sounds that are going to get in the way of someone on the other side being able to distinguish your words. Those consonants, those vowels are going to become garbled. You're not going to know what you're saying, especially if you're trying to call across several miles, as people traditionally do with hollering. So just using a melodic pattern that someone can recognize to mean something specific is more efficient. It's a different kind of language that you can learn. And hollering is a very, very old human art. People could have used hollering to communicate long before we had language. Because again, all you need is a melodic pattern for someone to recognize, to have meaning. You don't need language for that. There's a biomusicologist named Nils Wallen who suggests that humans used acoustic signals in hunting cultures during the Ice Age. So between 1.8 million years ago to 730,000 years ago. So what he's saying is that before we had language, we would have used hollering to communicate with each other. And then later, when we had semi-domesticated animals and got into having herding societies, we would have started using hollering with our animals as well. In any case, hollering is such a simple and efficient way to communicate that it's essentially a universal art form. Most cultures have had or still have some element of hollering, and it can be used for all kinds of daily communication. So, for example, the Voice of America, which is the U.S.'s federally funded broadcasting network, they once broadcasted a series of hollers from Sampson County, which we'll talk more about Sampson County in a second. And they got so many letters of interest back that they decided to have this competition and told people all around the world to send in their hollers. And so they got samples from Burma, India, Austria, Ecuador, Czechoslovakia, and Nigeria. And they named a Nigerian as sort of the winner of these entries because he could demonstrate the widest variety of calls. So included in his samples were hollers to call women together to gossip or to meet in the village square, calling to locate hunters out in the bush, calling to summon children to sweep the village square or to fetch water, hollering to announce a death, to announce that someone had died in the community, or hollering to warn that there's a thief loose in the vicinity. So we can really think about, in some cultures, these being a whole other layer of language on top of our everyday communication. And here in the US, hollers have been recorded in African American, some American Indian, and in African American communities, I already said that, and in white cultures as well. And almost certainly hollering has been a part of rural cultures and some urban cultures since the colonial period. We know that hollers were used as a form of communication in enslavement communities, that enslaved folks would holler to each other from field to field or from plantation to plantation, and that sometimes those hollers were used as coded communication, used as a way for the overseer to not know what was being said. However, hollering did die out to a great extent in this country by the mid-1900s. But there is one place where people continued to holler well after their neighbors had stopped, and that's Sampson County, North Carolina. Anyone ever been through Sampson County? Know Sampson County? Maybe. Well, now you can see where it's located here. So it's far away from us on the other side of North Carolina. It's a little south of, it's hard to tell from the map, but it's a little south of the Raleigh area. So in the 1970s, folklorists noticed that there was this tiny crossroads in Sampson County called Spivey's Corner, and it was hosting what was called the National Hollering Contest. So local folks had started the contest in 1969, basically as a fun way to raise money for the Spivey's Corner Volunteer Fire Department. And people were coming from all over the area and sharing hollers they'd grown up with. There were categories of competition for women, for men, and for children, and the event was very much like a county fair. There was bingo, there was an antique auto show, there was watermelon rolling and greasy pole climbing. There was also a conch shell blowing competition and a foxhorn blowing competition. So really cool stuff. And researchers got excited because it was clear that this contest, that it was clear through the contest that hollering in Sampson County was this living tradition, and it was still a very complex tradition. So that's not, and the contest in the 70s drew really big crowds. You would have as many as 10,000 people coming to the hollering contest. Yeah, it became very popular. And it became, it certainly became nationally famous, especially through some of the work that folklorists did to publicize it more. So several folklorists came in the 70s and recorded these hollers and interviewed hollerers about their art. And one thing that became clear was how deeply integrated hollering was into everyday life. And the folklorists distinguished the hollers into 4 categories. And the first is functional, so helping to accomplish some kind of work task. The second is communicative, which would just be sort of everyday kinds of communication. There are distress hollers, which is especially important. That's how you get someone's attention if you're in trouble. And then expressive hollering, which would be hollering just for enjoyment or to pass the time, for some emotional release. So we'll learn about these 4 categories and learn some hollers from each. So this first one, functional. This is something that you might use just laboring on the farm. A common kind of functional holler would be calling for water. So say you're out in the field and you want the person back at the house to come out and bring you some water. So this is a holler that was shared by a man named Paul Parker. and this is how he would call to his wife to bring him water. And I'll break it down and have you repeat each part. Let's do that. That's great. Now think about too, if you're, I mean, again, this is communication. And this is how it spreads. Well, here, I'll do another one. We'll talk more. Another common functional holler would be calling people in from the field for a meal. So this is a type of holler that a lot of women in the community would have done to call in other men and women from the field. So this is one that a woman named Paula Brown shared that her grandmother did when she was growing up on her farm. Let's do that. Yeah. So actually, let's do it 2 more times. I'm proving a point here, so let's do it. Okay, great. So I just had us do that a few times in succession because with any of these hollers, you wouldn't just do it once. You would need to be repeating it over and over again. Because again, this is communication often across several miles, and so you just have to keep repeating to make sure that you're being heard. We've heard enough of Sampson County hollering to know some characteristics about it at this point. You're hearing that high falsetto, right? We're using that very high part of our vocal range. And there are also certain common musical intervals with these calls. So to speak in music theory terms, we're moving from the 1 to the 5 to the 3. Or if I had started on a C, we're going from C to G to E. But in any case, these are intervals that are very common in a lot of Western music. And my point is that a lot of times the hollers that folks do come from the musical influences in their lives. We know that in African American hollering traditions in this country, the scale structures and intervals are often different. There was a woman named Annie Grace Moore Dodson. She was recorded in Alabama in the 50s, and she demonstrated a field holler that she had grown up with on her farm, and it went like this. Oh, oh, yay, yay. So I'll do that first part of the oh, oh, then I want you to do yay, yay. So, oh, Sampson County hollering, the folklorists couldn't, while there was a sizable African American population in Sampson County, the folklorists weren't able to find anyone oh, I lost my mic.
Just holler.
I'll holler the whole rest of the presentation. The folklorists weren't able to find anyone currently in the 70s, any African Americans who were still hollering. And so at that point, at least, it seemed to be a pretty exclusively white tradition. And those were the kinds of musical intervals that folks were using. So to get back to functional hollers, another functional holler that some of us might have thought of when we thought of hollering is hollering for animals, right? So you would use this if you were calling your hogs or your cows or calling your dogs to go hunting. These calls would be especially useful at a time when animals ranged in communal pastures, which is pretty common in our culture up until not too long ago.
So, for example, there was a farmer named Floyd Lee in Sampson County who talked about how he and his neighbors shared a communal field of about 300, well, several fields of about 300 acres that all of their hogs would be on, and each neighbor might have about 20 hogs. And so those groups of hogs all knew to recognize the calls of their owners and to come running. So sometimes when folks who are unfamiliar with hollering are told, like, oh, this is the call for cows, they might assume that there is just one universal call for cows that every cow knows to respond to magically if they hear it.
No, great. But that's not the case. It's very individuated. These are learned behaviors. So I'll do some cow calls, the variety of cow calls from Sampson County. So this was how Paula Brown learned to call her cow. Suka, suki, 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 suka, suki, suki, suka, etc. So that sounds kind of familiar to that suki that some of us have heard before, right? Another one, this was shared by Leonard and Manuel, it went like this. Chloe, 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 Chloe. So you can hear again that intentional vocal break that I'm doing, and assumedly his cow was named Chloe. And then the third one is one I'm going to make you do. This was shared by H.H. Oliver, and actually I'll switch slides here. H.H. Oliver is here on the right, doing a good holler. And the way he called his cow was like this. Whoa! Let's try that. It's like W. If I were to spell it, it would be W-U-E-Y. Let's try that. Whoa! Let's do it again. Whoa! Yeah. It's just fun to make y'all do that. Great, so that's not in the high falsetto. That's like in a totally different part of your vocal range. And when Mr. Oliver demonstrated his hog and his cow calls, he was using the same syllables, that boy, so those syllables, but he was using different pitches. So his call for his hogs was in a higher pitch. And he was just explaining that if his cows and his hogs are in the same field, they know to respond depending on the pitch that he's using to come to him. And if you grow up in rural spaces and work on a farm, this stuff is like, of course, people understand this, but if you haven't done that kind of work with animals, then it's not something necessarily would know. So the second category is communicative hollers. And the only thing that makes these slightly different than functional hollers is just that you might use them outside of a work situation. So do y'all remember the first holler we did? I'm going to do my part, and we'll see if you remember yours back. So, ahoo, ahoo, ahoo. Right? Do it for me. Awesome. Thank you. So that's an example of a communicative holler, right? That's letting, maybe say if we had agreed to meet down by the river at 9 o'clock, and I get there and you're not there, then I might do that holler, I might call it holler, to see where you are, to see how far away you are, and then you would respond. You could also use communicative hollers to let people know that you were on your way, like you were coming for a visit. So H.H. Oliver here and other hollers in Sampson County would talk about if they were courting someone and they were maybe a mile away and planning to visit, they would holler a bit so that their sweetheart would know that they were coming. And that would give their sweetheart a chance to change and to wash up and to be ready, when they showed up. And Oliver, joked that well, if you holler, it should smell a little better when you go. So sweet. But I mean, this because everyone's working, everyone is working in corn and cotton every day, so you wouldn't want to know if someone was coming to visit you. So there were also good morning hollers. done so that your neighbors would know that you were up and all was well. And actually, when I was, I'm derivating a little bit, but when I was learning about hollering for the first time, and I started to ask my family comes from farmers in East Tennessee, and I was like, Mama, do you know any hollers? Does anyone in the family holler? And she remembered that her grandfather, so my great-great-great-grandfather, would holler in the morning when he got up. He'd go out on the porch and he would just yell. And I don't think the rest of the family members appreciated that. But since I've learned about hollering, I'm like, oh, that was his good morning holler. So it can be sort of expressive, just as a way to be like, I'm up and I feel great. But it's also a way to let your neighbors know that you're doing okay and that you're going to work, that what part of your day you're in. So simultaneously, there were also evening hollers that neighbors would exchange to basically say that they were turning in for the evening, they were done with work. And this was a really practical way for people to keep track of each other. You would know when someone was up, when they were out, so maybe where you could find them. And also if you didn't hear your neighbor holler in the morning, or if you didn't hear them holler for a few days, you might want to go check on them. You would know that something has disrupted their daily work. So the third category is distress hollers, and that's a really vital one. So if you fell and hurt yourself, or if your house caught fire, you would want to do a distress holler. It was the fastest way to get someone to come to help. So the way that these often sounded might not surprise you. So I'll do an example of one, and then you can do it again with me. Let's do that. Great, yeah, so that's a siren sound, right? So I don't know if anyone's done any deep work around this, but it's theorized that the siren sound has been a distress sound, has been a warning sound for a long time in our culture. And in fact, ambulances and police cars and that sort of thing have borrowed from that it's this much older tradition. What's also neat is that even though that was sort of the universally recognizable distress call in Sampson County, individuals had their own particular distress calls that you would learn to recognize. So, for example, there was a farmer named Floyd Lee who told a story about being lost one day in a thicket of huckleberries. And he had to holler out to find his mother so that she could holler back to him and kind of Marco Polo his way out. And this was a distress call that he used. And I'll break this down too so you can do it with me. Woo! Let's do that. Woo! Distress calls could sound entirely differently than that. So H.H. Oliver, when he was growing up, his neighbor had a different kind of distress call when she needed help. And hers went like this. Woo woo! Let's do that. Yeah. So those all sound so different from each other, right? And so you have to think about how well people knew each other in these communities to be able to distinguish between your different family members' distress calls or your neighbors' distress calls. Distress callers could also be used for safety and working situations. So H.H. Oliver, when he was a young boy, helped his father do timbering, and after they timbered, they would tie all of the timber together into these 200 or 300 foot long rafts and take them down the river to sell further downstream. And if your raft got stuck in the process and you didn't want the next raft behind you to come crashing down on you, you had to do a specific distress call so they would know what was going on and pull over and then come and help unstick you And these hollers really saved lives. So, for example, Leonard Emanuel here on the left, he told a story about one time his wife heard a distress call down near the river, and so he went to see what was going on, and there was a young woman who was clinging to an upturned boat, and she'd been on an outing with her family, and in fact, some of her brothers had already drowned. Like, it was a really dire situation, and he was able to save her. So this was the 911 of the community, you know. And distress hollers were still very much in use at the time that these recordings were made in the 70s. So it happened a few times where a hollerer would be demonstrating for a folklorist, and he'd do his distress call, and then 5 or 6 minutes later, a neighbor would pull up in his truck and be like, "What happens? Is everything okay?" And you know, it's decades after the development of having phones in your home, and you know, and so it's still being used, still practical. So the last category is expressive hollering. So as I said before, they're done for enjoyment, they're done for emotional release, they can be therapeutic, and they can be done solo or in groups. And for this last category, I'll talk about ones from Sampson County and from other parts of the South. So in terms of solo hollering, several hollers talked about just hollering by themselves in fields, like at work, just to pass the time, especially at dawn and at dusk. A farmer who had some of his hollers recorded in the 1950s in Alabama said that he would just talk about how he was feeling and then end his expression with some vocables. So he might go, "Oh, I wish today was Sunday. Oh, like I wish I could see my sweetie. Oh." So just a way to talk about how you're feeling. There are also some expressive hollers that were recorded that were basically consisted entirely of words. So they're not really songs. Like, I still think they count as hollers. They're not songs. They don't have a set melody. They change every time. And there was an African-American singer named Enoch Brown who was recorded also in the 50s in Alabama. And he had a wonderful holler called, that he kind of thought of as a complaint call. So this was his. "Oh, if time don't get no better here, I'm going down the road, I'm going away to leave you. If the time don't get no better here, it's down the road I'm gone. If the time don't get no better, if the time don't get no better, it's down the road I'm gone." Thank you, Enoch. So yeah, these could be, I've talked so much about hollers that serve these purposes, and I think expressive hollers are a really important category because they have a lot of emotional expression for folks. Expressive hollering could be done communally as well, as I said. So in Sampson County, for example, the men would love to get together and holler at communal gatherings. So at a corn shucking, you know, on a farm, it might take hours to get done, and so they would just sit together and holler together. Supposedly, as the drinking increased, the hollering got better and better, as they all like to say. And they would holler in 2- and 3-part harmonies as well. So, yeah, this is like a really common expressive pastime. There's another kind of holler that folklorists like to call the trademark Sampson County holler. And I already did an example of that at the very beginning with that good morning holler, and I'll do another one. hear some of the things we've been talking about. We're using that falsetto, we're using certain intervals. I'm using that vocal break over and over. And we're trained to get rid of the vocal break in Western singing. If you've been classically trained in singing, you are not supposed to do that vocal break. It's considered ugly. But really, in a lot of traditional cultures, a lot of traditional singing cultures, the vocal break is an expressive thing. It's an intentional artistic choice. And that's what these hollerers are doing. They're using it as an artistic choice. And you hear that a lot also in Appalachian singing and in early country singing all over the place. You also heard this intake of breath, this thing I was doing, that ee, eh, woo, eh. That's also very specific to Sampson County hollering and another artistic choice. And one other kind of expressive hollering that was popular in Sampson County was hollering out tunes in falsetto. So Amazing Grace might sound something like this. Etc. So these tunes could be anything from hymns to the Star Spangled Banner to Santa Claus is Coming to Town. They like to do it with a whole variety of genres of songs. And again, they holler these in 2- and 3-part harmony. They got together in groups. I can't really do this type of holler justice, so I want to play a recording from a hollerer named Obie Jackson. And I think I'm going to have to move out of the slideshow, do this. Okay, it'll look the same for you, but here is Obie Jackson doing his rendition of Shortening Bread. Okay. Baby? Oh, we can't hear him. Okay, you don't get to hear Obie Jackson's version of Shortening Bread. But I have a list of resources at the end of this slideshow so you can listen to more of the Sampson County hollers yourself. I assure you, it's great. It's wild. It's awesome. So we've gone through some of these different categories. So I'm just going to close by talking a little bit about the state of hollering in the nation today. So why don't we holler as much as we used to? Hollering is still around, for sure. It's just not done nearly as much as it used to be. And that's largely due to technology changes. So, of course, we have many other forms of instant communication now. We don't have to shout to our neighbor to ask if we can borrow a cup of sugar, etc. Or we don't even have to shout to call for help necessarily if we can call 911. But another technological aspect is that our rural spaces have become industrialized. So there are so many interfering sounds now in rural spaces, whether it's planes or trains or cars, that would interfere with being able to hear a neighbor's holler. There's also, there are questions as to other reasons why hollering became less popular throughout the 1900s. And Richard Sullivan, who was a hollerer in Alabama, when he was interviewed in the 50s, he said that he had grown up with hollering, but at that point in his life wouldn't do it anymore except in private, that it had become this very embarrassing practice. As someone who sings ballads, Appalachian ballads and folk songs, that's something I also hear from a few generations back, early 1900s, especially as popular music, as it became easy to listen to recorded performers, and this idea of professionalism as a musician came about. People became embarrassed about their own vocal practices, about singing or maybe about hollering. So there's also this level of social embarrassment. And the hollering festival at Spivey's Corner has gone away. But maybe we can revive it. As I said, in the 70s it attracted as many as 10,000 people, but it became smaller and smaller in the last few decades, and it actually ended very recently in 2016, after 47 years. So there was an attempt in 2017 to revive it, and I'm sure there is still a lot of interest in continuing it. But I think there's hope for Hollering. Oh, I meant to show that one to you already, but we'll move on. Okay. There are several hollers who continue the Sampson County traditions of hollering, and you can see 3 of them here. They went on the Today Show with Stephen Colbert in 2016. The woman who's hollering is not a Sampson County hollerer. She was a guest on the show. But behind her are Robbie Goodman and Sheila Fry and Tony Peacock, who are all wonderful Sampson County hollerers. I think hollering still has a lot of practical uses. In rural spaces, think about how many spots in rural western North Carolina you don't get cell service. And if you live in one of those places, hollering can be a really practical way to communicate with your family and with your neighbors. Certain natural spaces also enhance the effects of hollering. So if you live near a lake or a pond, it can be really fun to experiment with hollering across that space. The sound carries very easily. But also, simultaneously, mountain spaces provide these reflective surfaces. And so that's really helpful if you're doing hollers too. They can carry a long way. And I also just think hollering is a great way to express how you feel. Like we heard with Tina Brown's holler. In the same way that some of us might like to sing or scream in the car sometimes, and no one can hear us, try hollering. Why not try hollering? So I'm going to end with an expressive holler that I made up based on the Sampson County hollering style and some of my other musical influences. Wow, 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 you way, wow, wow, you way, wow, wow, you, wow, you, wow, you way, wow, wow, you way. Thank you. So we have a little time if anyone has questions or discussion, or if you want to demonstrate a holler. I would love that.
I don't want to demonstrate one.
Okay.
But if a holler starts with one person, how does a community or a region learn it? How does it spread?
How did hollering spread?
How does it become a common language among a community or a region?
Well, I would think just through repetition over time. Do you mean if the art was just started by one person, how would it spread, or how would people in a community get to know each other's hollers?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think too about like herding cultures, which most anyone in their ancestry we've got some herding cultures. That's communication that necessarily takes place across wide spaces, and so that kind of memorization would have. I mean, I think it would be really fundamental to a lot of communities because you just can't use language to communicate across those spaces. So that is a good question in the sense that I haven't heard Sampson County hollers describe like, well, I sit down and I teach my holler to my son or to, so I think it would be, though now that I'm thinking about it, a lot of hollers, a lot of folks who were recorded did just describe growing up on farms and just learning by exposure what different hollers meant. In the same way that we sort of would with language. They just heard, they would see associationally like their mother calling a cow, and then they would know that that's the cow call. And so a lot of it was intuitively learned over time, from what I can tell. Other questions, comments?
Is there a library of calling somewhere? Like I know that Cornell has captured all the birds calls in one place. Is there some library that you can just check out different parts of the country and cultures?
So the question was, is there like a library or an archive where you can hear hollers from different parts of the country? I don't know of one, but I will share, these are some of my resources. And especially the second two, Hollering, that's a CD, so you can listen to lots of hollers that way. Those are all from Sampson County. And then Welcome to Spivey's Corner is a half-hour-long documentary on the National Hollering Contest, and it's fabulous. You will hear amazing stuff. So definitely check those out. And then you can also go to the Library of Congress, their digital archives. So like the Library of Congress, their archive of folk life specifically. You can look online for other hollering, and especially other hollers from African American traditions. You can access through that too. So that's what I know of.
What was the name of the person who did the short?
O.B. Jackson. Yeah. And everyone who I've talked about is featured on the Hollering CD there. So, yeah.
Can you turn the lights down so we can take a picture of that?
Yes, that will be worked on.
How did you get started on this?
How did I start doing this? I have been studying traditional song or regional song for a long time, and really somehow came across this Welcome to Spivey's Corner documentary. This website, the website that it's on, folkstreams.net, is an amazing resource, free resource of all kinds of documentaries on American folk life. So someone shared it with me, and then I was just really captivated. And I just love doing vocal breaks and just that sound, love it. So it was a good excuse to learn more of those. Yes.
I grew up in Chatham County, which is right exactly in the center of the state. It's a little bit west and a little bit north of Sampson. And my father called his cows that way, and his cousin's pasture was across, I wasn't very far away, and his cousin would call his cows a slightly different way. They had grown up together, and they had learned their calls from their dads, my grandpa and my great uncle. But my dad's call, it was for cows, I'm going to do it.
Please do it.
It was, swoo cow! Swoo cow! There was a lot more melody in the way he did it, quite frankly. And I tried to do it when I was a child, and cows wouldn't come. And this is kind of anticlimactic. He said, well, just take a bucket and beat it on the fence. And the cows would come running.
All right, they know the sound of food, yes. I want to mention, I would love anyone here who, even if you don't want to demonstrate a holler, if you know a holler, I would like to be in touch with you. I'm working potentially on an audio piece about hollering, and I'm trying to hear the different hollers that folks know. So I have just a contact sheet on my merch table, my merchandise table over there. So if you would like to, please write down your contact info, and I would love to record your holler. And thank you for sharing that. In the back, yeah.
Last Tuesday, we attended before they opened the brand new courthouse space. I'll never forget, among all the groups of fiddlers and so on around the perimeter, there was one little lady standing up in front of us on risers, doing what I think was what she called hog calling. And there was so much breathing, many notes, more like yodeling. But I had a feeling from like the sounds I heard tonight, she might have come from a whole different part of the South where they do more yodeling. I mean, there might be whole pockets we don't know about.
Yeah, I would like to track down that lady. Do you remember anything else about her?
The Shindig people might know how to get it.
Say it again?
The Shindig people
Might know. Yeah, I can look into that. Yeah, I wonder too, and I don't know if this has been studied, sort of what were the cultural influences that led to this kind of hollering in Sampson County, and I'm sure it was similar in other places. But Sampson County had a lot of folks from Scots-Irish backgrounds and folks from Swiss backgrounds, going back to the mid-1700s. So, of course, I'm like, oh, well, I mean, is this especially with all that falsetto and all those vocal breaks, it sounds so similar to Swiss hollering, Swiss yodeling. So it's interesting to think about where these different influences would come from. And that kind of falsetto and those vocal breaks, those were also done in African American communities too. That certainly was done by hollering of people of all backgrounds. So a lot of different influences came in. Any other questions or demonstrations? Well, thank you everybody so much. I will briefly mention that I have some merchandise in the back. I have a CD of solo ballad singing. I have a CD that features a lot of different artists doing wonderful covers of songs from Appalachia's Coal Wars. So educational and sounds wonderful. That's the Blair Pathways CD. And then I have a children's book on mountaintop removal coal mining, which is it's not as depressing as it sounds. But it's about the gifts that Appalachia gives us and the ways we can fight mountaintop removal mining. So, and I also have a Celtic band named Immigré, and we are always looking for gigs, so feel free to take my card from the back. So thank you so much.